Prologue: The Shadow of Empire. The year is 1931. In movie theaters across America, audiences watch Edward G. Robinson's electrifying performance in Little Caesar, a film that would define the gangster genre for generations. Rico Bandello, the character Robinson portrays, is a small-time hoodlum who shoots his way to the top of Chicago's underworld, only to meet a violent end. The film's title comes from Rico's obsession with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire. He sees himself as a modern emperor, building an empire through violence and cunning. The character's final words, "Mother of mercy, is this the end of Rico?" would become one of cinema's most famous lines. But audiences watching Little Caesar in 1931 don't realize they're watching a prophecy unfold in real time. In New York City, a real gangster nicknamed Little Caesar is living out the same rise and fall narrative that captivates moviegoers. His name is Salvatore Maranzano, and like the fictional Rico Bandello, he is obsessed with Julius Caesar, models his criminal organization after the Roman legions, and believes himself destined to rule an empire. Within months of the film's release, Salvatore Maranzano will declare himself boss of all bosses of the American Mafia. And within months of that declaration, he will die in a pool of his own blood, stabbed and shot in his Manhattan office, betrayed, like Caesar before him, by those he trusted most. This is his story, a tale of ambition without limits, power without wisdom, and the fatal price of believing yourself invincible. Act 1. The Priest Who Became a Killer. Chapter 1. Sicilian Roots. Salvatore Maranzano was born on July 31, 1886, in Castellammarese del Golfo, a coastal town in the province of Trapani, Sicily. The region was steeped in mafia tradition, where codes of honor, silence, and blood oaths governed daily life more powerfully than any law. As a youngster, Maranzano had wanted to become a priest and even studied to become one. This was unusual for a boy from his background. Most children in Castellammarese were destined for fishing, farming, or following their fathers into the mafia. But young Salvatore possessed an intellect and ambition that set him apart. He attended seminary, studying Latin, theology, and history. He had a fascination with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, and enjoyed talking to his less educated American Mafia counterparts about these subjects. The story of Caesar, his rise from obscurity to absolute power, his military genius, his transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire, captured Maranzano's imagination completely. But fate had other plans. He subsequently became involved in the ongoing feud between the Bonanno family and the Buccellato family, and with his skills soon gained the status of a military mafia commander. The young man who had dreamed of serving God found himself serving a different master, the ancient code of Cosa Nostra. Maranzano was married to Elisabetta Minore, sister of Salvatore Minore, an influential mafia boss in the city of Trapani and capo of the Minore Mafia clan. This marriage cemented his position in the Sicilian underworld, binding him to one of the most powerful crime families in the region. As the years passed, Maranzano's reputation grew. He was intelligent, ruthless, strategic, a natural leader. But Sicily, for all its traditions and power, was becoming too small for his ambitions. Across the Atlantic, America beckoned with opportunities undreamed of in the Old Country. Chapter 2. The New World. After World War I ended, Salvatore Maranzano followed many other members of the Sicilian Mafia and moved from his home country to the United States, entering Canada first and then reaching New York via Buffalo. He immigrated to the United States around 1925, settling first in Buffalo, New York at the peak of the Prohibition era. The timing could not have been better. Prohibition created enormous illicit opportunities for organized crime figures. The Volstead Act, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages, had transformed America's drinking habits into a massive criminal enterprise. Bootleggers were making fortunes overnight, and the Italian criminal organizations were positioning themselves to control the trade. Maranzano settled in Brooklyn and quickly established himself. He posed as a real estate broker, using this legitimate front to mask his criminal operations. But his real business was bootlegging, smuggling high-quality whiskey, running speakeasies, and building a network of loyal associates. He quickly recruited a loyal cadre of associates from his native Castellammarese del Golfo region in Sicily, forming the nucleus of his criminal network. These were men who understood the old ways, who spoke his language, who could be trusted. Among them was a young gangster named Joseph Bonanno, who would later remember Maranzano as a mentor and father figure. Because of his fascination with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, he was nicknamed Little Caesar by his underworld peers. The name was both compliment and mockery. Compliment for his intellectual ambition, mockery for his intellectual pretensions in a world where brute force often mattered more than education. But Maranzano understood something his rivals did not. Organization matters. Structure matters. The Roman Empire did not conquer the world through chaos. It conquered through discipline, hierarchy, clear chains of command. If he could impose that same structure on the chaotic world of New York's criminal underworld, he could build an empire that would last. Chapter 3: The Rising Storm. By the late 1920s, New York City's Italian-American Mafia was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The most important and profitable mafia operations in the United States were controlled by Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria in New York City. Masseria was old school, a mustache Pete, as the younger gangsters derisively called him. He believed in the traditional ways: Italians only, Sicilians preferred, outsiders to be exploited but never trusted. He demanded tribute from smaller gangs, imposed his will through violence, and ruled like a feudal lord. But Masseria made enemies easily. As part of his attempts to consolidate control in New York, Joe Masseria forced the resignation of Castellammarese boss Niccolò Schiro. This was a direct threat to Maranzano and his Castellammarese associates, men from their hometown, bound by ties of blood and tradition. The conflict simmered through 1929, a Cold War of intimidation and insults. But on February 26, 1930, the war turned hot. Masseria ordered the murder of an ally, Gaetano Reina. Masseria gave the job to a young Genovese who killed Reina with a shotgun. The Reina family, outraged by the betrayal, threw their support behind Maranzano. The lines were drawn. The Castellammarese War began. Act 2: The Blood River. Chapter 4: The War Begins. The Castellammarese War took place between February 26, 1930 and April 15, 1931, and it was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American Mafia history. The streets of New York ran red with blood as the two factions waged a brutal campaign of assassination and retaliation.
On July 15, 1930, Vito Bonventre was killed at his home. This led to Maranzano being elevated to boss of the gang, setting the stage for an open confrontation with Masseria. Maranzano proved himself a brilliant military strategist. He organized his soldiers like Caesar organized his legions, with clear hierarchies, defined roles, disciplined operations. His men moved through the city in bulletproof Cadillacs, some equipped with mounted machine guns. They struck swiftly, disappeared into the urban landscape, struck again. On August 15, 1930, Castellammarese loyalists executed a key Masseria enforcer, Giuseppe Morello, at Morello's East Harlem office. A visitor, Giuseppe Peraino, was also killed. Morello was a legendary figure, the clutch hand, founder of the first major Italian-American crime family in New York. His death sent shockwaves through the underworld. The violence escalated. On October 23, 1930, Castellammarese ally Joe Aiello, president of the Chicago Unione Siciliane, was murdered in Chicago. The war had spread beyond New York, drawing in organized crime figures across the country. But the tide was turning in Maranzano's favor. On November 5, 1930, Al Mine and a key member of Masseria's gang, Steve Ferrigno, were murdered. Francesco Scalice inherited control of Mine's gang and subsequently defected to Maranzano's faction. Masseria's alliance was crumbling. His men were dying or switching sides. Money that should have been flowing into speakeasies and gambling operations was being spent on bodyguards and weapons. The younger gangsters, led by an ambitious Sicilian named Charles Lucky Luciano, began to question whether this war was worth fighting.
Chapter 5. The Judas Kiss. Charles Luciano was Masseria's most capable lieutenant, smart, ruthless, forward-thinking, but he was also a pragmatist. He looked at the Castellammarese War and saw only waste, wasted lives, wasted money, wasted opportunities. Both bosses were mustache Petes, stuck in old country thinking. They refused to work with Jews, with Irish, with anyone who wasn't Italian. They saw the Mafia as a cultural institution rather than a business. And worst of all, their petty feud was bringing too much attention from law enforcement. Given the worsened situation, Masseria allies Luciano and Genovese started communicating with Castellammarese leader Maranzano. The two men agreed to betray Masseria if Maranzano would end the feud. The deal was simple but monstrous. Luciano agreed to engineer Masseria's death in return for receiving Masseria's rackets and becoming Maranzano's second-in-command. April 15, 1931, Coney Island, Brooklyn. Luciano lured Masseria to a meeting where he was murdered at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. The details of that afternoon have passed into legend. Masseria and Luciano enjoyed a leisurely lunch, veal, linguine, red wine. Afterward, they played cards, relaxing in the spring sunshine. Then Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 4 gunmen, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel then walked into the dining room and shot and killed Masseria. The boss of bosses died face down in his pasta, ace of diamonds still clutched in his hand. When Luciano emerged from the bathroom, he looked down at his former boss's corpse and said simply, "The fight is over." Chapter 6. The Victor's Crown. With Masseria dead, Salvatore Maranzano stood triumphant. The Castellammarese War was over, and he had won. At 45 years old, he was the most powerful mafia figure in America.
But victory was not enough. Maranzano had read his Caesar. He knew that winning a war was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, building an empire that would endure. Maranzano called a meeting of crime bosses in Wappingers Falls, New York, and declared himself capo dei capi, boss of all bosses. Hundreds of mobsters from across the country gathered to hear Maranzano outline his vision for the future of American organized crime. Standing before them like Caesar addressing the Senate, Maranzano unveiled his plan. With Masseria gone, Maranzano reorganized the Italian-American gangs in New York City into the 5 families, headed by Luciano, Joe Profaci, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and himself. Each family would have a boss, underboss, capos, soldiers, and associates. The families would be composed of only full-blooded Italian-American members, while associates could come from any background. It was brilliant, a military structure adapted to criminal enterprise. Each family would control its own territory, run its own operations, but all would answer ultimately to the boss of bosses, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano basked in applause and approval. He had done what no one else could do. He had brought order to chaos, structure to anarchy. Like Caesar transforming the Roman Republic into the empire, Maranzano had transformed the Mafia from a collection of street gangs into a true criminal syndicate. But there was one man in that audience who did not applaud, who smiled but felt only contempt. Lucky Luciano. Act 3. The Throne of Knives. Chapter 7. Seeds of Betrayal. Maranzano also whittled down the rival family's rackets in favor of his own. This was his first mistake. The younger gangsters had gone along with the reorganization because they thought it would mean more money, less violence, better business. But Maranzano was proving to be as greedy as Masseria had been, perhaps more. He demanded tribute from the other families. He inserted himself into their most lucrative operations. He made it clear that all major decisions required his approval. The title of Boss of Bosses was not symbolic. Maranzano intended to rule absolutely. Luciano appeared to accept these changes, but was merely biding his time before removing Maranzano. Although Maranzano was slightly more forward-thinking than Masseria had been, Luciano had come to believe that Maranzano was even greedier and more hidebound than Masseria had been. There was another problem: Maranzano's attitude toward non-Italians. Luciano had built his power base through alliances with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. These men were smart, ruthless, and profitable partners, but Maranzano looked down on them, calling them Galese behind their backs, treating them as inferior. This old-world prejudice infuriated the young Turks. They had grown up in America. They saw opportunity, not ethnicity. Money had no nationality, and neither should crime. Chapter 8. The Little Caesar Complex. From his 9th-floor office at 230 Park Avenue in the New York Central Building, later the Helmsley Building, Maranzano oversaw his empire. The location was symbolic, a prestigious address in Midtown Manhattan, towering over Grand Central Station. It projected power, legitimacy, sophistication. The office itself reflected Maranzano's personality. Books lined the walls: histories of Rome, biographies of Caesar, military strategy texts. He held court there like an emperor, receiving lieutenants and settling disputes, always drawing parallels between his organization and the Roman legions. Caesar crossed the Rubicon with discipline and loyalty. That's how we build power, structure, hierarchy, obedience. But there was a fatal flaw in Maranzano's worldview. Caesar had been assassinated by his own senators, betrayed by those he trusted most, and Maranzano, for all his study of Roman history, failed to learn that crucial lesson. Absolute power breeds absolute resentment. The young Turks whispered among themselves. Maranzano was a mustache Pete, they said. He talked about modernizing the mafia, but he was stuck in old-world thinking. He had simply replaced one dictator with another. Worse, Maranzano became paranoid. He saw threats everywhere, suspected everyone, and in his paranoia he made lists, names of gangsters he believed were plotting against him, names of men who needed to be eliminated. At the top of that list, Charles Lucky Luciano. Chapter 9. The IRS and Mad Dog Call. By September 1931, Maranzano realized Luciano was a threat and hired Mad Dog Call, an Irish gangster, to kill him. Vincent Mad Dog Call was one of the most feared killers in New York, a psychopath who murdered for pleasure as much as profit. He had earned his nickname through sheer brutality, and his reputation alone was enough to terrify most men. Maranzano summoned Call to his office and offered him a fortune to kill Luciano and several other troublesome gangsters. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. on September 11, 1931. Call would arrive, receive his payment and instructions, and then Luciano would be eliminated. But Maranzano had another problem: the federal government. The IRS had been investigating his operations, scrutinizing his finances, building a case for tax evasion. This was the same approach that brought down Al Capone, and Maranzano knew it could destroy him. To prepare for the coming audit, Maranzano ordered his bodyguards to leave their weapons at home. He didn't want to give federal agents any excuse to arrest him or his men on weapons charges. It seemed like a prudent precaution. It was a fatal mistake.
Chapter 10. The Trap. Tommy Lecussi alerted Luciano that he was marked for death. Lecussi was one of Maranzano's captains, but he was also Luciano's friend. When he learned of the plot to kill Luciano, he made a choice: loyalty to the future rather than to the past. Luciano moved quickly. He couldn't use Italian gunmen. Maranzano would recognize them. He needed faces that Maranzano had never seen, professionals who could get close without raising suspicion. He sent to Maranzano's office 4 Jewish gangsters whose faces were unknown to Maranzano's people. They had been secured with the aid of Lansky, Siegel, and Gambino. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Disguised as government agents, 2 of the gangsters disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards. The unarmed bodyguards, expecting IRS auditors, offered no resistance when the men in suits flashed badges and demanded they put their hands up. Act 4. The Death of Little Caesar. Chapter 11. September 10, 1931. On the afternoon of September 10, 1931, a group of between 4 and 6 men, witness and informant accounts vary, entered the office building at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. They ascended to the 9th floor office suite of Eagle Building Corporation, the Maranzano headquarters. It was a warm September afternoon in Midtown Manhattan. The streets bustled with businessmen, secretaries, tourists. The New York Central Building rose above Park Avenue like a monument to American progress and power. Inside Maranzano's waiting room, 9 people sat expecting routine business. Some were associates waiting to meet with the boss. Others were secretaries and staff. None of them were armed. The assassins strode through the door with the confidence of federal agents. They wore dark suits, carried briefcases, flashed badges that looked authentic enough to pass a casual glance. "Federal agents," one of them announced. "Nobody move, hands against the wall." The assassins entered the waiting area, brandished badges to the secretary, and forced the 9 other waiting room guests against a wall. The bodyguards, unarmed on Maranzano's orders, complied immediately. This was what the boss had warned them about:
federal agents conducting audits. Better to cooperate than give them an excuse for arrests. Chapter 12. The Execution. Upon entering Maranzano's office, a melee ensued. Maranzano's throat was slashed and his body riddled with bullets. Salvatore Maranzano, the man who would be Caesar, fought like a lion. At 45 years old, he was still strong, still quick. When the assassins burst into his private office and revealed their true intentions, he did not beg or plead. They grabbed Maranzano and then pinned him to the wall, where they proceeded to stab him multiple times before shooting him. The violence was personal, brutal, not just murder, but a message. They wanted to obliterate the man who had declared himself boss of bosses. Blood soaked into Maranzano's expensive carpet. The books about Caesar and Rome looked down on their fallen student. Outside the window, the streets of Manhattan continued their daily rhythm, unaware that history was being written in violence 9 floors above. The assassins worked quickly. The killers raced down the stairwell and into the history books of great gangland mysteries. As they fled down the stairs, they passed Vincent Mad Dog Call on his way up. Call, arriving for his 2 p.m. meeting with Maranzano, realized immediately what had happened. The men rushing past him, blood on their clothes, weapons hastily concealed, could only mean one thing. Mad Dog Call, one of the most feared killers in New York, turned around and walked away. He had been hired to commit murder, but his employer was already dead. The contract was void. Chapter 13. The Body. When police arrived at 230 Park Avenue, they found a scene of shocking violence. Maranzano's body lay in a spreading pool of blood, stabbed 6 times and shot 5 times. His throat had been slashed. His face bore cuts from the struggle. On his desk, papers scattered. On the floor, signs of desperate combat. The books about Caesar and Rome could not save him. The organizational charts modeled on Caesar's legions were irrelevant. In the end, Salvatore Maranzano died as violently as any street thug in a back alley. The immediate reaction to Maranzano's murder, especially from federal authorities, was to focus on a purported alien smuggling racket. A reporter discovered Maranzano's address book outside the office building, leading investigators to theorize it was thrown out a window or dropped by one of the killers. The little black book contained names that shocked investigators: judges, immigration officials, police captains, politicians. Maranzano had been building an empire not just through violence, but through corruption at the highest levels of government. Police Commissioner Louis Valentine made a brief but critical mention of Lucky Luciano as a person of interest, but there was no evidence linking Luciano directly to the murder. The actual gunmen were Jewish gangsters unknown to Maranzano's organization. They had vanished into the streets of Manhattan without a trace. The investigation stalled. Witnesses claimed they saw nothing. The waiting room guests held at gunpoint couldn't identify the assassins, or claimed they couldn't. Maranzano's bodyguards, humiliated by their failure to protect their boss, had no useful information. The newspapers seized on the story. "Gang boss murdered in Manhattan office," screamed the headlines. Columnists wrote breathlessly about the Mafia War, the ethnic criminal organizations, the failure of prohibition. But they missed the larger story. This wasn't just another gang killing. This was a revolution.
Act 5. The Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Chapter 14. The Purge That Wasn't. This assassination was the first of what would later be called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. The legend, as it would be told in the decades to come, was dramatic.
Immediately after Maranzano's murder, dozens, some said 90, of his loyalists were killed across America in a single coordinated purge. From New York to Chicago, from Detroit to Los Angeles, Maranzano's allies were eliminated in one night of blood. The story had its origins in the testimony of underworld figures and the speculation of journalists. It became part of mafia lore the night Lucky Luciano consolidated power by eliminating all opposition in one swift, brutal stroke. But the historical reality was more complicated. While it is true that some mafiosi known to be friendly to Maranzano were murdered within a few days of the Supreme Boss's assassination, and some other killings were attempted without success, there is not evidence of a vast conspiracy or large numbers of coordinated attacks. The truth was less cinematic, but perhaps more significant. Maranzano's death marked the end of an era, not through mass murder, but through a shift in philosophy and power structure. The Mustache Petes, those old-world bosses who clung to Sicilian traditions and ethnic exclusivity, lost their authority. The Young Turks, led by Luciano, took control, and they would reshape the American Mafia into something Maranzano never imagined. Chapter 15: The Commission. Lucky Luciano did something revolutionary. He abolished the title of Boss of Bosses. Although there would have been few objections had Luciano declared himself capo di tutti capi, he abolished the title, believing the position created trouble among the families and would make himself a target for another ambitious challenger. Instead, Luciano created the Commission, a governing body where the heads of the major families would meet as equals, resolving disputes through discussion rather than violence. No single man would rule the mafia. Power would be shared, balanced, checked. It was a distinctly American innovation. While Maranzano had tried to impose a Roman-style dictatorship, Luciano created something closer to a board of directors. The mafia would operate like a corporation, with each family running its territory as a franchise. The commission would oversee the families, mediate conflicts, and make decisions affecting all of organized crime. It would bring stability, reduce violence, and maximize profits. It was pragmatic, efficient, and utterly foreign to the old Sicilian way of doing things. Maranzano had studied Caesar and the Roman Empire, but Luciano had studied something else, American business, and in America, the corporations were winning. Chapter 16: The Legacy of Little Caesar. The 1931 film Little Caesar, starring Edward G. Robinson, had premiered just months before Maranzano's death. Together with The Public Enemy, 1931, and Scarface, 1932, Little Caesar proved to be influential in developing the gangster film genre, establishing many themes and conventions that have been used since then. The parallels between the film and Maranzano's life are eerie. Both Rico Bandello and Salvatore Maranzano idolized Julius Caesar. Both rose from humble origins to rule criminal empires. Both declared themselves supreme bosses, and both were destroyed by their own ambition and the betrayal of their lieutenants. Leroy's direction in Little Caesar helped establish the conventions of the gangster film, including the rise and fall narrative arc, the portrayal of complex anti-heroes, and the depiction of violence as a means to power. The film's final scene, Rico dying in a gutter gasping, "Mother of Mercy, is this the end of Rico?" became iconic. It captured something essential about the gangster's fate. No matter how high you climb, no matter how much power you accumulate, the fall is inevitable. Maranzano's death mirrored the film's narrative so closely that it seems almost scripted. But life imitated art not because Maranzano watched the movie and failed to learn its lesson. Rather, both the film and the reality captured the same fundamental truth. Absolute power corrupts, ambition destroys, and empires built on violence will fall through violence. Act 6. The Aftermath. Chapter 17. The Families Endure. The 5 families that Maranzano created survived his death: the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, originally Profaci, the Gambino family, originally Mangano, the Genovese family, originally Luciano, and the Lucchese family, originally Gagliano, continue to exist in diminished form into the 21st century. Maranzano's organizational structure, boss, underboss, capos, soldiers, associates, became the standard for American organized crime. His vision of the Mafia as a disciplined hierarchical organization rather than a loose collection of street gangs became reality. But the rest of his legacy died with him. The title of Boss of Bosses was never revived. No single man would ever again claim supreme authority over the entire American Mafia. The commission, not a dictator, would govern. Chapter 18. Joseph Bonanno's Memory. Joseph Bonanno, one of Maranzano's protégés, lived until 2002. He wrote an autobiography, A Man of Honor, in which he portrayed Maranzano as a father figure, intelligent, cultured, honorable. In Bonanno's telling, Maranzano was a victim of the crude, greedy gangsters who couldn't appreciate his vision. He was a man of the old world, misunderstood by the new. His death marked the end of the Mafia's noble traditions and the beginning of its descent into mere criminality. But the real truth of Maranzano's life is not that honor died with the old ways, it's that honor was never part of the equation. The Mafia has always been about power and profit, dressed up in the language of tradition and respect. Chapter 19. The Empty Office. For weeks after the murder, Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue remained sealed, a crime scene. When police finally released it, the Eagle Building Corporation, Maranzano's front company, quickly dissolved. The furniture was sold, the books dispersed, the organizational charts destroyed. Today, the Helmsley Building still stands at 230 Park Avenue, towering over Grand Central Station. Commuters rush through the streets below, unaware that 9 floors above them, the boss of bosses died in a pool of his own blood. The building has been renovated, modernized, transformed. Nothing remains of Maranzano's office except photographs in police archives and memories in history books. Act 6. The Aftermath. Chapter 17. The Families Endure. The 5 families that Maranzano created survived his death: the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, originally Profaci, the Gambino family, originally Mangano, the Genovese family, originally Luciano, and the Lucchese family, originally Gagliano, continue to exist in diminished form into the 21st century. Maranzano's organizational structure, boss, underboss, capos, soldiers, associates, became the standard for American organized crime. His vision of the Mafia as a disciplined hierarchical organization rather than a loose collection of street gangs became reality. But the rest of his legacy died with him. The title of Boss of Bosses was never revived. No single man would ever again claim supreme authority over the entire American Mafia. The commission, not a dictator, would govern. Chapter 18. Joseph Bonanno's Memory. Joseph Bonanno, one of Maranzano's protégés, lived until 2002. He wrote an autobiography, A Man of Honor, in which he portrayed Maranzano as a father figure, intelligent, cultured, honorable. In Bonanno's telling, Maranzano was a victim of the crude, greedy gangsters who couldn't appreciate his vision. He was a man of the old world, misunderstood by the new. His death marked the end of the Mafia's noble traditions and the beginning of its descent into mere criminality. But the real truth of Maranzano's life is not that honor died with the old ways, it's that honor was never part of the equation. The Mafia has always been about power and profit, dressed up in the language of tradition and respect. Chapter 19. The Empty Office. For weeks after the murder, Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue remained sealed, a crime scene. When police finally released it, the Eagle Building Corporation, Maranzano's front company, quickly dissolved. The furniture was sold, the books dispersed, the organizational charts destroyed.
Today, the Helmsley Building still stands at 230 Park Avenue, towering over Grand Central Station. Commuters rush through the streets below, unaware that 9 floors above them, the boss of bosses died in a pool of his own blood. The building has been renovated, modernized, transformed. Nothing remains of Maranzano's office except photographs in police archives and memories in history books. But the ghosts are there. The ghost of a man who dreamed of building a Roman empire in Manhattan. The ghost of a priest who became a killer. The ghost of Little Caesar who reached for absolute power and grasped only death. Epilogue: The Lesson of Little Caesar. The story of Salvatore Maranzano is often told as a footnote in the larger narrative of American organized crime. A transitional figure between the old mafia and the new, a brief boss of bosses whose reign lasted mere months. But his story resonates because it captures something timeless about ambition, power, and human nature. Maranzano studied Julius Caesar obsessively. He knew how Caesar rose from obscurity to become dictator of Rome. He understood Caesar's military genius, his political cunning, his transformation of the Republic into an empire. But Maranzano failed to learn the most important lesson from Caesar's life. The man who seizes absolute power signs his own death warrant. Caesar was assassinated by the very senators who had supported his rise, and Maranzano was murdered by the gangsters.